Welcome back to the CFB Whispers Show, Halloween edition. I hope that you and your families had a great time last night. Today is obviously November 1st. And of course, we have week 10 ahead of us, less than 24 hours away. Super excited to obviously break some of those games down for you. But if you have not already, before we actually crack into everything that we're going to be discussing, go ahead, go down there, like, subscribe, share this with anyone who is a college football connoisseur. So if you live, breathe, bleed, sweat, anything along those lines, college football, we all know here on this show, college football is a religion. And sorry if that offends some of you guys, but hey, some of us were just raised certain ways, and this is just how it is. So at the end of the day, really appreciate your support. I'm only doing this by myself. Of course, I do have some special guests here and there because I like to give people opportunities to actually get their names out there. But all in all, we did hit our goal of 2,500 subscribers. We started this show over 2 months ago, a little bit around that time. Now we're roughly 34, so our next goal is 4,000. We can't do this without you, and I say we as in myself because you guys are what motivate me, and I really appreciate your all support. So anything in terms of content or anything you'd like for me to discuss, or if you actually just like the video altogether, just let me know. I mean, that's ultimately the reason why I'm here. But as you guys can see here, we are going to be discussing a plethora of things. The AP poll top 25. Of course, we'll break that down here in just 2 seconds. But before I do that, we're going to be going over what's the play, right? And again, if you have seen the show, you know the play is basically what we're going to be discussing. And we will be discussing some of the games coming up in week 10. Maybe there's going to be some sort of upsets. I don't know. We're going to be discussing that. But then, of course, we're also going to be breaking down exclusively the Georgia-Florida game. That's going to be exciting. And then I will also be releasing, based off our model, our top 25, power rankings. Hurt your feelings. Okay, so here's the deal. The Hurt Your Feelings top 25 power rankings, CFB Whisper Show exclusive. We're going to start with 11 through 25. As you can see, Florida in our model, according to what they've done thus far on the field, is at that number 25 spot. I'm sure a lot of you will probably agree. Some of you will disagree. I'm saying arguably 75% of you will disagree as to why Florida is there. They have 3 losses. Why should they be there? Well, I'll tell you. Florida is there because if you look at the 3 losses that they have, that being to Miami, Texas A&M, and Tennessee, all 3 of those opponents have a combined loss record of only 2 losses. So take that as you will. Granted, they're all 3 top 10 teams. They lost to them, and they seem to be playing the best football that they've played thus far this year. Now, granted, a lot of you Florida fans probably thought this is a little bit new news to you all because how did they start the season? Essentially 1-2 with losses to Miami and losses to Texas A&M, obviously, to start. I mean, that's not really what you want. And then obviously you have Billy Napier dropping that game all entirely on him and that coaching staff in Neyland Stadium against the Tennessee Volunteers. I think if you just know college football, you know that Tennessee found a way to win. So I don't want to discredit the fact that they actually did win. But at the same time, we also understand that Florida going into halftime, that game shouldn't have been close. Nico's obviously not proven the ability to put the team on his back. He has overthrown several of those balls that could have potentially led to either big gains or potentially scores altogether, but he didn't. And Florida obviously found a way to, keep that a ball game. Ultimately still ended up in a loss, but hey, guess what? All 3 still only a combination of 2 losses. So good for Florida. They have rounded our top 25 at number 25. Now, Missouri is one of those weird teams where they're not totally what we anticipated being coming into the season, especially when you consider the type of season that they had last year, the amount of returning production that they had coming into this season. And they still find ways to win. Now, granted, they did get embarrassed, against Texas A&M, but Texas A&M is obviously undefeated right now in SEC play. They're number 1 in the entire conference. So, good for Mike Elko and that squad. We'll be discussing that here in a moment once we get to that. Now, of course, Colorado, they tend to just be a little bit more complacent, in my opinion. Colorado is one of those teams where I'm not really sure if Dion is going to continue his coaching career once his sons have, graduated from the program. But, he's doing his thing. He's making an impact. That's exactly what college football is all about. And they're still winning fucking football games. Excuse my language. But I'm very passionate about this. Now, if we were to just go ahead and move on to Kansas State is just doing what Kansas State does, right? They don't have the best strength of schedule. They don't have necessarily an extremely impressive head-to-head win, but our model tends to like them at 22. And if you want me to elaborate more on Kansas State and you're a Kansas State fan, make sure you obviously leave your comments and thoughts, and then, of course, what you would like for me to discuss come that time. Now, Ole Miss, this is a little bit of a trickier one, right? Now, Ole Miss with Lane Kiffin having, heard some whispers, of course, around the college football landscape, not really sure if he's actually truly entertaining the Florida job, really not even sure if Billy Napier is actually going to be out. We have no idea. If you guys listen to any Gator podcast, you'll know that they do anticipate, obviously, foregoing the Billy Napier era and then moving on, but we've yet to actually have definitive evidence on that. And Billy Napier is obviously still there, and that team seems to be playing for him. Ole Miss, on the other hand, though, they do have some depth issues. They are playing well, but Jackson Dart's not the kind of quarterback that we anticipated him being going into this season again in comparison to how we seen him play last year. And almost as if Jackson Dart is a little bit of a thorn in the side of that offense in comparison again to last year. But Ole Miss is still winning some games. They are still producing some points. Yes, they had that embarrassing loss against Kentucky, but they seem to have, rebounded since then. And of course, our model likes them at 21. Now, if we were to move to LSU, in my opinion, LSU, and this is no shade towards LSU fans, but LSU is one of those teams where I think that they've been playing a little bit above their potential. I do think there's a ton of talent, especially if you look at the FPI rankings in terms of overall roster talent. However, I think Nussmeier's a hell of a quarterback. I think their offensive scheme altogether is great. I do think they could have busted that game wide open against Texas A&M. Unfortunately, they weren't able to execute on a couple of things. And then obviously you have Texas A&M and Mike Elko throwing in the backup quarterback, and LSU obviously had no answers for that. That ended up breaking the game wide open for Texas A&M instead of LSU. And of course, that's what you come to find out. That's the reason why the score was what it was. LSU ended up dropping to 20 in our power ranking. Now, granted, it is weird that Alabama is at 19. If we were to just go ahead and move on to number 19, Alabama's not been your traditional Alabama team. We all know Alabama's more accustomed to playing that ground and pound type of scheme. They want to get in your face. They want to obviously bully you. And then, of course, they want to play very, very physical defensive football. And, of course, that hasn't been happening thus far lately. Now, granted, a lot of you also think that Mike DeBoer is the issue. Mike DeBoer is not the issue. He's had success everywhere he's ever been. He's exactly, in my opinion, where he needs to be. I do think Alabama will eventually rebound. He did inherit this program and was able to, of course, recruit some players, but this team is not entirely his. Not to say that he shouldn't be able to produce anything in terms of success and Alabama be able to keep that momentum that they've had essentially since the beginning of the Nick Saban era, but Nick Saban and Mike DeBoer are two completely different types of minds. And granted, they might have both had success everywhere they've been, but Mike DeBoer, again, is not the GOAT. And I'm just going to throw that out there. Alabama's not playing Alabama football. We might see a new brand of Alabama football coming, out over the next few years. And Mike DeBoer might return Alabama to what we expect them to be, what we know them to accustomedly being altogether. But as of this very moment, you have to give Mike DeBoer some credit, because it is a first-year team. It is a first-year head coaching job within a new conference, and I just don't think that this is ultimately what we're going to see from Alabama moving forward. Granted, this is a learning experience. This is a new conference experience, and that's why our model likes them at number 19. They still control their own destiny, but of course, if they were to win out, and of course, Tennessee were to somehow drop a game, especially a conference game, Tennessee would have that tiebreaker, but that's a conversation for another day. Now, if we were to move on to number 18, Army's obviously doing their thing. I don't really have much to say about Army. They don't technically play in the best conference. They don't technically play the best competition altogether. They are holding their own. They are doing their thing. I do appreciate Army obviously being in the top 25. I don't want to discredit that. So if you're an Army fan, forgive me. But at the end of the day, we are not accustomed to seeing Army in the top 25 or actually changing their offensive identity like they've been doing as of lately. It's obviously panned out for them. Huge credit to that coaching staff and how they're obviously conducting that culture. So good for them. Now, if we were to move on to number 17, Illinois Illinois is obviously doing their thing as well, but Illinois has kind of always done something very similar, at least in the last 5 to 6 years. Not really sure how far they'll go. Don't really understand how they're ranked at number 17 in terms of head-to-head based off our model. So, of course, if you guys want to disagree with that, totally fine. Just give me your thoughts and opinions on it. SMU is very similar, sitting at number 16 according to our Hurt Your Feelings CFB Whispers top 25 power rankings. They aren't also in the best conference. They're also not playing the best competition. They don't have arguably one of the better wins head-to-head. Now, granted, you could look at SMU, you could look at Illinois and say, how is Alabama and LSU behind them? LSU obviously, doing their thing. They were winning all the way up until this past weekend against Texas A&M. And then, of course, Alabama, they had only lost to, of course, Vanderbilt, which I don't want to discredit Vanderbilt necessarily, because Vanderbilt, in my opinion, is a little bit better than the traditional Vanderbilt teams that we've come to know. But Alabama is just not what they are. So, moving on from SMU at 16, number 15, Washington State. Again, not necessarily the best competition, but the teams that they played, they are defeating them in a convicting like way. It's just something that you would expect an elite team to do, especially in comparison to the competition that they have. And I can say the same thing for number 14 in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is doing their thing. Pittsburgh absolutely just came out of nowhere and just embarrassed the team that they played this past weekend. So obviously huge credit to Pittsburgh. They've been on an upward trajectory for the last couple of years. They gave Tennessee a good run for their money last year. I'm sure you guys know that. Obviously Tennessee ended up coming away with that victory, but Pittsburgh definitely gave that game away. But again, it's based off what your perception is and if you think, Tennessee found a way to win or whatnot. Now, if we were to move on to Iowa State at number 13, Iowa State, I just really like their head coach, man. He's a down-to-earth kind of guy. He's a no bullshit kind of guy. He wants to play disciplined football on the offense, on the defense, on special teams, and really he holds his players accountable. We knew this going into the season. I'm a big Iowa State, fan, but I'm also not a fan of the team altogether. That's not my main team. If you guys want to know who my main team is, of course, just let me know. But Iowa State, we expected them to be where they're at exactly. Similar to Boise State. I mean, they have a Heisman Trophy running back. Boise State's sitting at 12. Obviously, who in the world is going to stop that running back? I don't know, because we haven't seen it thus far this season, but Boise State's obviously handling their business. Our model likes them at number 12. And then Notre Dame. Of course, Notre Dame had that embarrassing loss, but they seem to have regrouped ever since then. They are sitting at number 11. They do only have one loss, but of course, they're not in a conference. They don't have the best strength of schedule. And of course, a lot of people, especially if you're a Notre Dame fan, you want to throw out how in the coming year they're going to play a schedule that is actually respectable. And granted, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But as of this very moment, the only impressive win that they have, in my opinion, on their resume is against Texas A&M, who, again, is undefeated in conference play in the SEC and is number one in that conference. But this right here, I would love to have your all's thoughts and opinions on this, so definitely leave your comments, thoughts, and, of course, let me know what you think. If you guys have any content that you'd like for me to discuss, let me know as well. But since we've already gone through 25 to 11, let's just go ahead and do 10 to 1, and I'll see you again once more on the other side. Okay, so here we are. The Hurt Your Feelings top 25 power rankings, CFB Whisper Show exclusive. We are finally here, the 1 through 10. We'll go ahead and start at number 10. Number 10, BYU. They are a team that is just full of relentless effort. They are always finding ways to win. Even if they found their way behind the 8 ball early in the last couple of games, they are just a team that just knows how to win. They understand how to win. They want to win, and they are winning. So BYU obviously rounds out our top 10. As you can see, at the number 9 spot, Clemson. Clemson is just a team on fire. If I were just any opposing team, I would not want to play Clemson right now. They, granted, are not playing in the most elite of conferences, but they are handling teams like an elite team should. They're going in, and they're just absolutely on fire right now. I am super excited to potentially see a matchup between Clemson and Miami since they do not play each other during the regular season. Maybe we'll see that in the ACC championship game. Maybe, Cam Ward will actually have some sort of challenge in comparison to what he's experienced thus far. Granted, that Miami defense is a little sus, but Clemson can, capitalize on that. And if Clemson can, or if anybody that goes against Miami can capitalize on Miami's inability to defend just anything defensively at this very moment, and make it so that Cam Ward obviously can continue to keep this team on his back. Like Cal almost knocked them off when they got that, really, really far head lead. Like, I mean, I don't know, man. Clemson's just a dangerous team. Miami looks a little sus, but we'll get to that in a moment. If we were to move on to number 8, Indiana. Indiana is obviously one of those teams that, again, if you had told me before the season started that they were going to be where they were at, I wouldn't necessarily be shocked, but at the same time, I also would be like, maybe not. But they are a team, again, that they also know how to win. They're a team that looks like one of the more complete teams in terms of the big, right? Or the Big Ten. So Indiana's looking pretty sharp. We'll see. They have some challenges coming up as we conclude the remainder of the back half of the 2024 season. Excited to see how kind of that unfolds. Indiana, their head coach, he's accustomed to winning. Just Google him, remember that, and we'll see how that plays out. Now, moving on to number 7, Ohio State. I know a lot of you are obviously going to disagree with this, but again, our model is specifically based off best wins head-to-head thus far throughout the season. It's not based off your ranking. It's not based off your strength of schedule. Ohio State has only legitimately played one team altogether that could have been ultimately the deciding factor whether they're in the top 5 or where they're at this very moment, sitting at number 7, and that is when they played Oregon. Now, granted, Oregon was able to generate some explosive plays, and Ohio State for some reason can't seem to run the football anymore, and their offensive line seems to be a little bit depleted. But I do believe if you were to play that game on a neutral field 9 times out of 10, it might not go Oregon's way, but I would still lean 50-50. It's really going to depend on, can Ohio State get that running game going. But Ohio State seems to still have some issues in terms of finding their identity at this very moment. They do have some depth issues, and hopefully they can figure that out because they have a big one this weekend against Penn State. But they are sitting at our number 7 spot because, again, they do not have the best head-to-head win thus far up through 10 weeks of the college football season. That might change after this weekend. We'll see what happens. Now, moving on to number 6, Texas. Texas is obviously one of those teams that, Texas is just a very interesting team because Texas, they come into the conference. They think they run the conference. We had already discussed this. They had played Michigan in the Big House. They ended up embarrassing Michigan. Everybody thought, okay, this is the year that Steve Sarkisian, they had figured it out. They have the depth. They have the playmakers. They have everything going for them. And then they have this team is in Georgia coming into Austin. Obviously, that was going to be another thing that could have potentially kept them at the number 1 spot according to our rankings, but it ended up dropping them because if your best win is against Michigan and Michigan has already 2 losses this year, it's kind of hard for us to say that that's arguably one of the more impressive wins. And until Texas continues to play the remainder of the schedule, that's either here or there. I don't anticipate Texas actually climbing the ladder within the next couple of weeks unless they just absolutely embarrass the teams that they're going to be playing. Now, granted, moving on to number 5, Miami. Miami is absolutely one of those teams, again, like I've mentioned before, they are begging for a loss, but they are also a team that finds a way to just win games. They are relentless as well. Miami with Cam Ward, he just doesn't give up. He'll make mistakes. He'll throw interceptions. He'll turn the ball over altogether. They might be behind, just like, again, if you reference that Cal game, they were behind by an exceptional amount of points, but then they found a way to come back and win that game. Miami is obviously one of those teams that they just know how to win football games, regardless what the scoreboard says, regardless at what time period it is. There could be 3 minutes left, and for some reason, if Miami is down by 3 touchdowns, Cam Ward under center, I would be willing to put my money on that because he is a game difference maker, and he's proven that thus far. Now, number 4, Tennessee. Tennessee is obviously sitting at number 4 because if we were to go based off head-to-head wins, they obviously have an impressive win against Florida. Florida's, again, there are 3 losses that they have. Those opponents have a combination loss total of only 2 losses. And then, of course, Alabama. Alabama's not necessarily an impressive team thus far this year under Mike DeBoer, first year anyways. But Tennessee still has found a way to beat both Alabama and Florida. And they are only 1 loss in the SEC. Granted, they did drop 1 to Arkansas, so don't obviously crucify me because I have them at number 4 and they lost to Arkansas. Arkansas is not a bad team, and if you guys want to argue that, let's just go ahead and let's debate it right now because I do think that Sam Pittman and that Arkansas crew have some things cooking, and we might see what that looks like come to the end of the season. But Tennessee might actually end up dropping out. Hell, they could potentially even drop this Kentucky game. I don't see them dropping the Kentucky game because it is a night game in Neyland Stadium. And of course, they did have a bye week leading up to this, but I also understand what that rivalry looks like. I also understand Kentucky tends to give Tennessee a good run for their money, but Tennessee tends to be the one that comes out on the other side of that in more cases than not. And I do think that Tennessee is a little bit more of a proven team in terms of being able to win a football game. I understand that Kentucky's played Ole Miss, and they did embarrass Ole Miss. I also understand that they played a very close game against Georgia, and then, of course, they still lost that game. But I also know that they got embarrassed by Florida, and Florida played a very close game to Tennessee. And I also understand, too, that that's not how you can technically compare these two teams based off who played who and how close that game was, because anything can happen on any given Saturday. But I just have to go based off what our model says. And Tennessee sitting at one loss, even if it is against Arkansas. Arkansas is an up-and-coming team at this very moment under Sam Pittman. We're excited to see, obviously, how that concludes for that program. But Tennessee does have two impressive wins over two rivals, that being Florida and Alabama. Now, moving on to Texas A&M. Texas A&M under Mike Elko. Nobody expected him to technically come in and do what he was doing, but people also weren't totally against the possibility of him coming in and doing what he's doing because Jimbo Fisher was obviously able to recruit at an extremely high level. He just wasn't able to put the pieces together like it seems Mike Elko is doing. And with Mike Elko's defensive mind, he's able to do certain things and confuse the opposing team in terms of their offense and their scheme into just being able to make the right play, the right call, the right adjustments at the right times. Texas A&M definitely has that four-leaf clover type of thing working in their favor. They do have a ton of talent along that entire roster, so it really doesn't come to a massive surprise that they're number 3. A lot of people want to think that it's a massive surprise because they are under first-year head coach Mike Elko, but Mike Elko is no stranger to winning, football games. Obviously, if you followed his career, he's also had success everywhere he's been. And that culture over there, they just seem to understand what it takes to win football games. They make the adjustments at the right time, and that's obviously proof in that LSU game where LSU could have broke that game open, but instead Texas A&M made an adjustment. LSU couldn't adjust to that second-string dual-threat quarterback, and that game got busted out. Texas A&M continues their undefeated streak in the SEC. And so if we were to look at the head-to-head, Texas A&M has beaten Florida in Gainesville. They've beaten Arkansas. They've destroyed Missouri. And then, of course, they come out of nowhere and they beat LSU. So there's no shock as to why, in my opinion, and also based off my model, Texas A&M should be sitting at number 3. They're actually very comfortable there. But moving on to number 2, Oregon. Now, granted, Oregon hasn't played the toughest schedule, but then they did play, arguably, in my opinion, one of the top 3 to 4 teams in the entire country. Of course, that game could go either way if we were to play that again on a neutral field on any given Saturday. But on that specific Saturday when they played Ohio State, they ended up coming away with the best of it. And I do think that's mostly due to the explosive plays that they were able to generate. They are they are undefeated, And I just think that there's not really another team at this very moment that seems to be more complete than Oregon, other than maybe two or three other teams, but I'm not going to digress. Now, if we were to move on to Georgia sitting at number 1, Georgia did have that loss to Alabama. They were down by 4 to 5 touchdowns. And, of course, they did find a way to come back. Georgia turned the ball over 5 times in that game. They still found a way to lose by 7 points only. So they obviously made some halftime adjustments. They obviously have a culture in place that's used to winning. They have a winning identity. And it just seems like even though they might not have been playing consistent offense and defensive Georgia-like football after losing that game, watching that Texas game, it's almost like they just kind of reintroduced themselves to the college football world and said, hey, listen, we're Georgia. We're here. We're back. We're going to continue to win this way. We're getting towards the end of the season. This is when we need to turn on the Jets a little bit, and we need to reassure everybody, those people who were doubting us, those people that thought that Georgia isn't what Georgia used to be. Georgia is still Georgia. Kirby Smart is still there. That staff is still there. Carson Beck is still there. They may have some depletions along the running back, the running back side of things in terms of that area. But they do have an incredible running back in Trevor Etienne. He seems to, in my opinion, be that MVP for Georgia football right now. Carson Beck's obviously thrown 8 interceptions. We'll talk more about that here in a moment when we break down the Georgia-Florida game. But altogether, Georgia does have a really impressive resume. As I mentioned earlier, Clemson, obviously, they beat them earlier in the year, but it just seems like after that game, Clemson caught fire. Then all of a sudden, Georgia goes, and then they've been beating everybody. Whether it's pretty or ugly, they're still winning. And again, our model is based off of head-to-heads. And then they go into Austin. They absolutely embarrass Texas. And, the rest is just what it is. So if you guys have any thoughts or opinions on what it is based off our power ranking models, this is the Hurt Your Feelings segment. Super excited to hear what you guys think. Of course, let me know your thoughts. That's what makes this extremely entertaining and wants me to continue doing this. I can't do this without your all support. So let me know again. But for now, let's just go ahead and move on into the Georgia-Florida exclusive CFB Whisper breakdown. See you on the other side again.
We got a little work in last week on Thursday on Florida. I think they're playing their best football. I think they have a really, really good roster. A lot of players we've recruited and recruited against them. But they're playing their best football, and obviously a talented group, really a lot of great size across the front on the offensive and defensive lines. I think Billy knows that's where the key is in the SEC in terms of length and size. They play a lot of players on defense. They've had a lot of guys play up front. But their 3 losses have come to 3 teams that are ranked in the top 10. At least I think they are. I don't even know. But they're really good teams, and they played those teams well. So a lot of respect for Billy. He and I have worked together before. I think he's building a really good program down there, and he is a tremendous football coach. And he does not leave any box unchecked, I can assure you of that, and know a lot of their staff. So should be a great game in Jacksonville. It looks like it's going to be great weather. It's always a really tough, hard-fought game. I think it'll be one of the most physical games we play all year.
Did you guys just listen to that? Did you hear what Kirby Smart had to say? He's definitely giving recognition in terms of Florida playing their best ball thus far. He's definitely giving recognition in terms of the roster overall and what Billy Napier's building. I know a lot of people don't want to look at Florida and say, okay, they are a good team. They have 3 losses. But again, if you actually paid attention, you would know that according to our power rankings, the 3 losses that Florida has are to 3 top 10 teams. They also have a combination of only 2 losses. You have Tennessee with 1 loss, Texas A&M with 1 loss. Miami's obviously undefeated. And then, of course, Florida is actually playing their best football as of this very moment. It just seems as though from that bye week on, something had just flipped, and now they want to actually play, and they're starting to show up. They absolutely embarrassed Kentucky. That's something that a lot of you Florida fans were probably a little shocked on, because I know for a fact, having Florida fans as friends, they did not anticipate that game turning out the way that it turned out. But I also know that Kentucky was on a 3-game winning streak. That's just absolutely mind-blowing. If you are following college football together, I think Florida was on like a 27 to a 30-game winning streak before obviously Kentucky officially knocked Florida off for the first time in the swamp back during the Dan Mullen era. But now all of a sudden you just fast forward, you look at this Florida team. They obviously lost to Miami to open up the season. Then they turned around and they lost to Texas A&M, both of those being home losses. Now they're looking at 1-2. Everybody thinks that this entire season, this entire staff, Billy Napier is absolutely done for. He's toast. He's already gone. The booster's already looking for a new head coach. That might be the case, but at this very moment, we can only go based off what we know. And what we know is that he's still there and these players are still playing for him, and that they are indeed, just like Kirby Smart stated a moment ago, playing their best football thus far. So with that being said, he did acknowledge their roster altogether. He did acknowledge that they do compete with Florida in terms of some of these players that are difference makers for the Florida program, the ones that are actually showing up and making it seem as though Florida's turning this corner. Now, this team is extremely young, but they are doing what they need to do, and now they are led by DJ Lagway. But if I were to just go a little bit sideways here before we actually take a deeper dive into this Florida-Georgia game, I can tell you this. Florida is a really good team. They are very fundamentally sound, despite the coaching errors that prove otherwise, to a degree. Georgia is arguably one of the best teams in all of college football. Yes, they dropped that game against Alabama, but they still found a way to come back being down 4 to 5 touchdowns, and they still only lost by a touchdown despite turning the ball over 5 times, which is absolutely insane if you just think about it. I mean, you can't turn a ball over 5 times against anybody in college football, yet alone against an Alabama or a Georgia, and still expect to be within 7 points. But Georgia still found a way to make those halftime adjustments. They came back, they did their thing, and then, of course, Carson Beck turned the ball over, which is obviously a big pain point for the Georgia Bulldogs heading into this game. Carson Beck's thrown 8 interceptions. That's the most interceptions. He's already surpassed the total amount of interceptions that he's thrown altogether last year. This isn't the Carson Beck that we are anticipated, seeing going into this season, but he is still the cream of the crop in terms of the offense and how they produce and what he's doing. So I want to make sure that I put a big emphasis on this. A lot of people want to put a big emphasis on Trevor Etienne and how he had transferred and how these Florida players want the revenge. And there's just so much that goes into that. But at the end of the day, this is a game that just needs to be played. And Georgia just came off an extremely impressive win in Austin where their defense absolutely showed up. I believe they had, 6 sacks. They had several tackles for loss. They held that extremely explosive Texas offense, under a certain amount of yards, and they absolutely embarrassed Texas as the number 1 team on their home turf. And obviously you fans, with you guys throwing things out in the field, you guys are already aware you weren't happy about that. But Georgia proved to everybody that, hey, you want to doubt us? We're here. We're going to continue to play. This is Georgia football. We're not running away from anything. We are known traditionally to start slower. And we are also known to turn it up a little bit as the season progresses, because when it progresses, these teams start to get better. You can actually tell the contenders in comparison to the pretenders. Georgia's obviously showing up, but we also know that Georgia's defense hasn't consistently shown up consecutively throughout this season so far. Now, can they repeat what they did against Texas when they play Florida? That's the question. That's actually a really solid question. I do think that Georgia's going to come prepared because Kirby Smart, obviously having played at Georgia, knows just what this means, this rivalry altogether. But here's my thought on Kirby Smart and the Georgia program. I do think that they are depleted, obviously, in the backfield. They have Trevor Etienne. They have a freshman running back behind them. They obviously lost their other running back to a season-ending injury. That doesn't mean anything. Trevor Etienne, in my opinion, because of the way Carson Beck has performed thus far, has carried Georgia throughout, their season so far. But I do think that defense has found something. I do think the defense is going to show up, and I don't think it's not going to just show up against Florida. I think it's going to show up as the season continues. Now, here's my thoughts on whether or not I think this Georgia team is going to be able to keep it close, or can they just bust the floodgates wide open and absolutely demolish Florida. We know in the last couple of years, Florida tends to start a little bit strong. Georgia also starts strong, but then Florida just doesn't have the horses to obviously keep up with this Georgia program. And then Georgia with the depth and then the coaching experience and the halftime adjustments, or just the adjustments altogether, they end up running away with the game. It doesn't end up being close, and that's just what it's been as of late. We also know, if you follow this history in terms of these two programs and how much of a rivalry this is, it really doesn't matter who's the better team in a lot of ways. Now, granted, the better team does typically win in this game, but this game in particular, in my mind, is really going to boil down to, can Florida generate enough explosive plays despite their quarterback being as inexperienced as he is? He is a generational talent. He's obviously doing some incredible things. That stat line that he put up against Kentucky is just something that not many people have actually seen. And if you have, then I want you to reference it. Go ahead and drop that in the comments. But here's my thought also on the Georgia offense. They have been able to run the football a little bit, but they have been more of a pass-heavy offense thus far. Typically, they take a script from the Alabama playbook. They usually utilize the run to open up the pass. Now they're utilizing the pass to open up the run, but then the pass isn't technically working out as well as they would like to. Granted, the interceptions total anyways, in terms of what Carson Beck has performed thus far this year. And then you have to rely heavily on Trevor Etienne to obviously do some things. He's not really technically known as the best pass blocker in the backfield, but he can definitely catch the football, and he can definitely make some things happen when he gets the ball in his hand based off that being a screen pass, or maybe they send him in motion to do a quick little slant. He is an electric player. If you're a Florida fan, you know that. Now, can this Florida defense show up? Because if this Florida defense shows up like they did against Tennessee, and especially like they did against Kentucky, granted, there were some blown coverages in the secondary, and that's something I do believe that Carson Beck can exploit. But if they are fundamentally sound, they are aggressive, they do attack the football, they play just freely, and they're out there, they understand their assignment, and they can minimize Georgia's offense. And then obviously minimize the running game, knowing how Trevor Etienne plays, because this dude was literally on this team a year ago. And there's some personal vendetta that's attached to this. What would that mean for Florida? If Florida can keep this game close, in my opinion, I do think that it'll be a good game. That's no news to anybody. I do think that Florida is able to generate those explosive plays, but I also believe if I were to flip it to the Georgia side, I think that Georgia, just knowing the experience and what that coaching staff has been known to do in terms of making adjustments, not necessarily at halftime, but just throughout the game, they are going to be throwing some mixed coverages against him to kind of confuse DJ Lagway. Again, this is nothing new to anybody. If you actually look back at the Anthony Richardson tape, you would know that Anthony Richardson looked like a deer in the headlights whenever he was playing, but yet Anthony Richardson had his way against the majority of the teams that he played prior to the Georgia game. And then it just seemed like when that Georgia game came, that speed and the scheme and just the mixed looks and everything, he didn't really know what to do with the football. So I'm kind of curious if Georgia's going to take a similar approach, if they're going to be more aggressive, if that defensive line for Georgia shows up in the way that they did against Texas. Is Florida's offensive line, with how well they've been performing in the last few weeks, going to be able to pick up on all of these different looks and still protect the quarterback, give DJ Lagway enough time to actually go through his reads and then deliver the football? Now, also, is DJ Lagway capable of completing the short to intermediate passes? Because all we've seen thus far is these explosive plays. Now, if you're a Florida fan, you're super excited because he's not afraid to pull the trigger and he wants to split that narrow window, and it's obviously playing huge dividends, but he hasn't seen a defense like Georgia. So there's a lot of variables that actually go into this. Now, Georgia, they are traditionally known to obviously just slow ground and pound, as you're aware. Then, of course, you have Carson Beck, who he just out of nowhere is just not turning out to be the quarterback that you want. But that doesn't mean that he's not capable. He is going back to his hometown. He wants to play in front of, obviously, all of his friends and family. Everybody's going to be there. Is this a game that Carson Beck turns it around, and then all of a sudden they combine a quarterback and an offense that's producing at a very high level in combination with that defense that came off of that impressive performance against Texas? Can they keep that up? If so, then they're a complete unit, because, I mean, Georgia's Georgia this time of year. They are starting to play fundamentally sound and as a unit. But Florida obviously coming out of nowhere and playing the best football, like you heard Kirby Smart say a moment ago. This is going to be a really good game. Now, it could be a massive blowout if Georgia is able to confuse DJ Lagway, and then they were able to capitalize on some very youthful mistakes. That's a massive possibility. But if Georgia's out of coverage and that Florida offensive line tends to show up and Florida's able to establish some sort of run game, and then they keep the defense honest, they don't go deep, and then that defense for Georgia thinks that they're playing a respectable, hey, we're going to, stay in more of a zone, or we might think that we have better athletes than you do. We might do man, and then we still might play a zone in the back end. If that's the case and Florida is able to generate some sort of run game, even though the Georgia secondary is extremely fast, Florida's wide receivers are proven to be extremely fast as well. They've also proven thus far, even in games that they've won, lost, they can get behind the secondary. Now, granted, again, they haven't gone against a Georgia team like this, but I do believe that we will see some explosive plays. I do believe that we will see some mistakes made by DJ Lagway. Or if you're a Florida fan, you're hoping, best case scenario, DJ Lagway comes in and he has a game of his career, his life thus far. He's very new, obviously. And then this gives something not only for Florida fans to look forward to, but something for Georgia fans to prepare for moving forward. Now, we're going to see a bunch of wrinkles thrown into this And in my opinion, if Florida's defense doesn't show up, this game isn't going to be close. I do think that Georgia's going to want to utilize the run. They're going to want to not necessarily say, hey, Trevor Etienne's over here now. Now we're going to use him against you guys. I don't think that that's necessarily going to be the main objective in terms of why they would utilize Trevor Etienne, but I do think that they will utilize him because of depth. And I do think that that's ultimately what they want to do. They want to be able to maintain the clock, control time of possession, run the ball, force Florida to stop them, pull Florida secondary up, and then utilize Carson Beck and his ability to read the defense to go over top. Or just from a pure athlete perspective, if they were to throw it to, like a screen, or if they were to throw a quick slant, put the football in, the playmakers' hands and let them go out there and do their thing, because Florida is suspect in terms of passing defense. So it's going to be an interesting one to see. Now, if I were to flip it to Florida, if DJ Lagway comes out, granted, there's not much film other than explosive plays. They get him more comfortable. They roll him out. They do those short to intermediate passes as if Graham Mertz was actually back there running this offense. And then the defense ends up creeping up because they're also mixing it really well, like a nice balanced song and dance type of short to intermediate pass with a solid blend of a run game that's actually proven to be effective. And then that defense, again, like I mentioned for Georgia, ends up pulling up. And then you have this speedy wide receivers that Florida does have, despite Georgia's defensive players also being speedy. Florida finds a way to get behind the secondary because they've been able to do so thus far. And then DJ Lagway has been able to drop that bread in the basket. I mean, you couldn't pass it any better than what he's done so far. You might as well just hand the ball off to him. And we're talking about 40-plus yards. If Florida finds a way with the explosiveness that they're capable of doing to generate some plays that lead to points early on, and then you put this game on Carson Beck's shoulders, knowing that he's notoriously known for throwing at least 1 to 2 interceptions, maybe not every game, but I mean, we've only been through this will be the 10th week, and he's already thrown 8 interceptions. So you're looking at an 80% interception, at least 1 interception per game. What happens? Now, we could play that game where Georgia is going to, force turnovers because their defense is elite and DJ Lagway is inexperienced. And then obviously you have DJ Lagway being extremely explosive, and he's able to, exploit what's already been noticed as a weakness for this Georgia defense, and that is passing yards beyond 20 yards. They've had several already this year that have made significant impacts on the game. Just look at the Alabama game. This is a huge coin flip, but here's the thing with where my mind is. Georgia is obviously the number 2 team in the country. Florida's playing the best ball that they've played so far this year. Florida players are obviously playing for Billy Napier. Whether or not Napier is there next year or not, I don't believe, regardless the outcome of this game, Napier will still be the head coach. They're going to give him an opportunity to obviously see the season through. Based off an insider that I have, they are stating, and this is an anonymous booster, if you actually follow the programs like I do, because this is a college football show, we follow all the programs. Billy Napier has to hit 7 wins. He's currently sitting at 4. As you can see, he's 4-3 right now. And the next 5 games are obviously a gauntlet. This is something that's been discussed since the schedule was obviously released. Georgia is obviously now, as of this very moment, November 1st, in the evening. We are less than 24 hours away from this game kicking off. A 14.5-point favorite that dropped. It was a 17, then it was a 16.5 for the majority of the week. Now it's a 14.5. I don't know exactly why. I think a lot of people are kind of riding that high wave on Florida playing the best ball that they're playing, and that it might be a little bit of a closer game because Georgia's kryptonite is a dual threat quarterback, somebody that can explode that secondary and generate those explosive plays. But we don't know if DJ Lagway is capable of doing that at such a state. But we also know that DJ Lagway is mature, and we've yet to see even the defenses that he's gone against, and that being a Tennessee defense as well, in my opinion, being the best defense he's gone against thus far, unless you want to argue and say Texas A&M is, arguably a better defense. I mean, of course, I would argue with you on that because I do think Texas A&M is good, but Tennessee's defensive front is just on a completely different level. DJ Lagway's been very calm, hard to shake him. He's delivering when he needs to deliver. This game's going to be a lot closer, in my opinion, than I think. If Georgia does win, it might be by 10 points. I don't think it'll be by anything beyond that. I think that Florida is going to come in with some scripted plays and they're going to be able to generate some things. And unless certain players within a certain scheme or just play all together just don't execute and DJ Lagway turns the ball over to start the game, and then Georgia obviously finds some sort of rhythm on the offensive side of the ball, despite them not having done so thus far this season, it could get out of hand, but I do think it's going to be close. Now, looking at it like this, obviously, this is something that not many people are actually talking about. Now, if you follow the history of this, you obviously know that Georgia leads the all-time series. Both these programs can agree on who has, the upper hand. I think it's a differentiation factor of like 2 games. So like, take that for what it is. But look at what I have here posted. So as you can see, from 2011 to 2013, Georgia obviously took a 3-game winning streak. Then from 2014 to 2016, Florida took a 3-game winning streak. And then it just repeats the cycle. I mean, tell me we're not in a simulation. Tell me this isn't something that isn't worth noting. A lot of people want to talk about the depth and the roster and just who's coaching and who's playing who and the FPI rankings and who's ranked what and strength of schedule, etc. Blah, 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 blah. The reality is this is still a competitive game. This is still a rival game. And it just looks based off history from 2011 to this point. When a team in this series wins 3 games in a row, the other team wins the 4th one. Just look at it. It's right here. I'm not making this up. It's right here. Just look at it. It's insane. So if we were to go based off history, does Florida win tomorrow? And if so, what would that take? Like, what does Florida have to do to actually pull this off? Because I think if Georgia's defense is able to remain consistent and they're able to stay playing the same style of aggressive defensive football that we're accustomed to them playing, and the game that they played against Texas and how they were able to limit and minimize that explosive offense, and that shows up because again, we haven't seen that since. This game could get ugly, especially when you consider an inexperienced quarterback, a quarterback that's never played in this game before. But again, he is a generational talent and he's not afraid to pull the trigger, and he is going to test you. You can throw whatever you want at him defensively. He is going to test it. Kind of reminds me of like a little bit of a Cam Ward, right? Where Cam Ward, he'll throw some interceptions, but he just flips the switch. He knows his team is down. He knows he's possibly the main reason why that's what it is. And then he finds a way to continuously generate those explosive plays. Now, is DJ Lagway capable of doing that this year? We're yet to find out. But I know that when there was about a minute left in the game, when Graham Mertz went down against Tennessee in Neyland Stadium at night and DJ had to take over and it became the DJ show, DJ ended up coming through clutch, through a absolute dime of a post route to Shamir DK to tie the game, which forced it into overtime. And then, of course, as you're aware, like I mentioned a moment ago, that Tennessee defensive front just absolutely took over. The same situation could come about, not necessarily the overtime, but the same concept in terms of Georgia's defensive line could be the differentiating factor here in this game, in my opinion. But if Florida's offensive line is able to pick up different schemes, understand blocking assignments, play disciplined football, Florida's able to manage, some sort of running game on the ground, and then DJ Lagway hits on at least 1 to 2, maybe even 3 or 4 of these explosive plays, and then they end up scoring, and then Georgia is just only able to run the football effectively because Carson Beck, it's not that he's incapable. I do think he's one of the more better quarterbacks in all of college football, and I do think that he's going to be playing on Sundays. And I do think that he has his best games against this team, arguably. If he's unable to, though, and Georgia's only able to run the ball, and Florida's proven as of the last few weeks, granted, again, it's not against the Georgia team, to stuff the run. They did stuff UCF, which at that point was ranked the number 3 rushing attack in all of college football. We all also understand how that unfolded. UCF seems to have kind of crumbled up from that point on. And then Kentucky obviously having a top 5 defense, and then Florida just absolutely running all over them. And then we also understand that Georgia had a very close game against Kentucky. I know you can't play the game of, well, this team played this team and this is what this score was. And because this score was very close, when they play this other team, it's going to be a really close game in that way too. No, it's absolutely not that way. But I do think if you just look at the history, Florida might have a fighting chance. I think Florida has the playmakers. I do agree with Kirby Smart. I think they have the roster all together. I do think that they're playing their best football. And I do think that this game is going to be a lot closer if these things line up in the way that I'm mentioning. Florida has to be able to generate some explosive plays. Florida has to be able to stop the run. They have to play very sound pass protection in terms of their defense. They can't leave that one or two player wide open like they have against Kentucky, like they have against Tennessee, because if they do, Carson Beck, even with him having not necessarily the best year, he's still capable of hitting and connecting on those, even if Georgia doesn't have that elite playmaker on the outside that's able to change a game. So with that said, I do think that this game is going to be less than 14 and a half points. I wouldn't be shocked if obviously Georgia's defense showed up, forced a couple of turnovers against that inexperienced quarterback. But I would say if DJ does return next year, this team does return next year, Carson Beck obviously ends up heading off into the NFL draft. There is a lot to be said about this Florida team moving forward. And we, in my opinion, are going to be able to see, not necessarily will the script flip, but will these games be a bit more competitive moving forward with the returning production? Granted, that does hinder on Napier returning. So, if I were to leave this with a prediction, I'm looking somewhere along the lines of I do think that Georgia is still going to find a way to win this game. I just don't think it's going to be by more than 14 and a half points. Go ahead and, oh man, I'm going to change my mind right here, right on script. I think Florida finds a way just based off history. So you guys can crucify me after the fact. I think Florida finds a way to win this game 24-20. Final score, Florida takes it home. They restart a new thing. This doesn't technically save Billy Napier's job. I think what is set is set. We'll find out what that means moving forward. But 24-20, I have it as Florida is going to take this. This would be a huge win for that program. I think this would be a huge just momentum builder and just kind of give Florida fans something to look forward to moving forward. But it's definitely an uphill battle. And again, I wouldn't be shocked if Georgia just ran away with this. But right now, based off what I've seen thus far, and Florida obviously playing the best football that they're playing in Georgia, obviously not being able to reciprocate habitually or on consecutive weeks anyways, consistent football, this is going to be a lot closer than a lot of people think. I think Florida really wants this. I think Georgia's obviously just looking at this like it's another game potentially, but I also understand that Kirby Smart knows that this isn't just another game. He played in this game, so he's going to have his players up for it too. I just don't think Georgia's as explosive, and I don't think that they're capable of being as explosive as Florida is capable of being. And if it comes down to a shootout, I don't think that Georgia wants to shoot out unless that defense is obviously performing. And that defense hasn't showed up consistently. So give me Florida 24-20, and let's see what happens. We'll obviously give our post reaction video, and we'll see you on the other side.